So this month is kind of a soft theme. In a roundabout way, it's Werewolvember, and I figured it was a good time to rank some lycanthrope films, dead last style. Like, we already did a best of vampire list, so this seemed like the next step. Although, I gotta tell you, there's a much smaller pool of films to dip into, quality flicks in this genre, but we're looking at some gems right here, and I ultimately chopped it down to 12 movies to pick from. And this was a really hard call, and I ended up eliminating one because it didn't feature an actual werewolf in it after all. But yeah, this was the list we went with, and I guarantee there'll be some comments about what movies should have been on here. But guess what? They're not! And these ones are. And I sent this list out to my patrons, and these guys answered the call. And I had some record participation and received 53 rankings, including mine. And you can include your ranking as well by becoming a patron on patreon.com/movietimelines. Patrons get a list of movies every month to rank, and with 53 total lists, that means that our top possible score would be 53 points. That's if every single person ranked one movie in first place, worth 1 point each. And we have 12 movies here, so if all 53 people ranked the same one in dead last, here worth 12 points, the lowest score a movie can get would be 636 points. But let's get right to it, because I just know that everyone can't wait for one thing. And that's to complain about how I pronounce werewolf.
I'm a werewolf.
And coming in at our dead last spot, the mutt of the litter. And oddly enough, the second highest grossing entry on this entire list, but also the most expensive one here, so it still lost money. But with 505 points, we're looking at The Wolfman from 2010, the remake of the Universal classic. It took the dead last spot 14 times, and the highest score that it reached was third place, which it got one time. And I totally agree here, since I also put this one in dead last. And yeah, it deserves to be here, but honestly, it's not really all that bad. It's not here because it's a terrible movie. It's just so completely unremarkable and overall meh that there's no reason to root for it. I get that it's meant to be a remake of the older film and sort of follows that one storyline, like all the way up until it really, really doesn't. But it just doesn't come anywhere close to the vibe of that film. And, oh yeah, because I'm sure it's one that I'll hear about not including, I didn't include the Universal Wolfman movies or the Hammer Wolfman films because we literally just covered those like a month or two ago in the Universal and Hammer ranking. So if you're really curious about how the patrons felt about any of those entries, just head on over to those dead last episodes and you'll see. But this one is absolutely trying to hit that old school Universal aesthetic, but falling flat on its face. And there's just something I don't like with modern films using a big budget to try to create a gothic Victorian atmosphere, because it all just looks like Hollywood backlot. Like, nothing looks natural or real. And not in that quaint way like in the classics where at times it's an obvious backdrop, since it's all so overdone and clearly costs such a large part of the budget. But that's not the most glaring issue with this one, because that's our Wolfman himself. Del Toro's performance in this is so sleepy. I mean, it's like they asked him, like, "Hey, Benny, do you want to be in the Wolfman?" And he said, "Yeah, as long as I don't have to appear awake at any time." And they said, "Sign here." I mean, this is a leading man role. And it's also the whole tortured protagonist thing that is a bit tougher to play because it's a guy doing bad things. So his human persona should be pretty sympathetic and charming. And Del Toro can do that, but I guess didn't feel like it? I do like the Wolfman design, and it is a nice change of pace from the standard large wolf thing that recent lycanthrope designs have run with, and it's cool to see a more classic rendition. The CGI transformation seems to work okay when they're just showing fragments. Like seeing his hand change works, but the second they get to his face, it's garbage. I mean, it's certainly not the worst CGI wolf I've seen in movies, but I will say that a portion of my rankings here did sort of get affected by how much I enjoyed the werewolf design. And I'll also point out that this is the only film on the list in which the creature is completely CG as opposed to a practical effect. And I don't know if that's the reason it's in this position, but I will say that it didn't help. And on the plus side, there's more gore here than you would expect.
I am what they say I am. I'm a monster.
Our drop down to number 11 was pretty deep since the Wolfman was very, very clearly the dead last. Like, there was never even a competition, really. But our second to last spot earned itself a pretty strong 454 points. 50 points lower. And it's one of the newest films to be featured here, and it's WolfCop. This was ranked in dead last 11 times, only 3 less than the Wolfman, and the best score that it got was second place, which it got twice. And oh man, I have this in 8th place, but I'll say this. For what this movie represents, I should have been able to place this higher. Because as a movie, this has all of the ingredients of something that I really want to see. And then it manages to do so many things right, but then also do an equal amount of them wrong. Like, one of the things that I do really like is the way that it establishes its own little world early on. It's able to create this unique vibe with the town and its inhabitants and the characters. Like, between the radio broadcast, the advertising around, and the dialogue, it feels like this fully realized environment to set this all in. And I always appreciate that. It's usually an indication that they've taken the time to sort out these little details about their story and flesh them out. Something that a lot of low-budget films don't really bother with. But then, the problem is that it's all just so uneven. There's a good deal of this movie that really seems to want to be taken seriously and sort of be like a supernatural take on RoboCop or something. But then, there's this whole other side to it that really wants to be a trauma-level gross-out comedy. It blindsides you with this whole, hey, we're going to just do something crazy and have him transform junk first. Like, the transformation begins with his penis, and they actually show it. And you're like, whoa, this is gonna be crazy. But then it just puts on the brakes and feels content to not push those boundaries for quite a while and tries to be more serious again. And it never really finds that happy medium. One thing that I will lavish praise on, though, is that wolf design. I love it. It's pretty much what you would picture when someone says the words wolf and cop, and works well with being a practical suit. Plus, it's a nice middle-of-the-road combination of the old-school biped werewolf and the more modern look. That design is what pushed it up a touch more for me as well. And that transformation, because besides the whole penis thing, which I got a genuine laugh out of, the rest of it is pretty nice, and it makes use of some good effects. The whole idea of bursting out through the human skin isn't really new, but it's done pretty effectively here. And again, I just wish the rest of the vibe matched what they were doing here.
Lou, you're a wolf.
Cop.
Coming up next in our 10th place spot, this was a bit of a closer race. And this is one that kept rising and falling and dropped into 11th place for a while. But then, the last couple of days pushed it up to 10th. And with 440 points, we have Bad Moon. This one was only ranked in dead last 3 times, but it was also put in first place twice. So people were pretty split on this one. And I guess I'm a little closer to those putting on the lower end of things, since I had this one in 10th place. But I will say this, I do like this one. And it certainly doesn't mess around and make you wait for any activity. No, this movie gives you solid werewolf action right out of the gate. It's like 3 minutes have passed with no werewolf. So let's go ahead and rectify that. Granted, the intro here is basically, here's the opening of every werewolf movie ever. But it's a bit different in that it's not as shy about its monster as other movies sometimes are. And overall, it's very enjoyable, but pretty surface level. I feel like this script is sort of like someone fed every werewolf movie into an AI generator and said, give me the sum total of all of these, and this is what it spit out. But then you get the strangest part of this movie. Once Eddie and the Cruisers goes to live with one of the Hemingways, because they're meant to be brother and sister, but the vibe that they give off around each other feels like that one Folgers ad. And if you're unsure what I mean by that, just go look it up, because it's freaking hilarious. But yeah, I don't know if these two were like boning in their trailers behind the scenes or something, but every time they're together, there's an inordinate amount of tension flying around. But one of the problems is you never really understand the motivation of the uncle. Like, he seems like he doesn't want to kill people and chains himself up. But then he's basically evil. But you never really know why. It's hard to tell if he feels any remorse. And if he doesn't, then why? Was he always a heartless dick? Or is that a factor of the lycanthropy? But there's one reason to really get more into this one, and it's Thor. This is his show. Like, hell, the book that this is based on is called Thor. So it's no surprise that he's front and center. And that dog is awesome. I wish more movies had a canine protagonist, because he's super likable, easy to cheer for, and probably worked cheap. And as I said, part of this really depends on how much I like the wolves themselves. And I like this wolf. The head definitely looks a little robotic at times, but for the most part, it's a solid practical effect. But the ending, I have to spoil since I object to it. The wolf and Thor fight it out, and Thor follows a wounded Ted as he becomes human, and I guess kills him. But like, why would that kill him? He's a werewolf. Like, bullets didn't kill him. Why does a dog bite? Like, I want to say that it's because he's in human form, but he had all the wounds that he received in his changed form. So, like, that version is vulnerable to bites too?
Well, I guess this means that you'll have to stay until they lift the curfew, huh?
I guess.
So you want some breakfast?
Yeah, great.
Okay.
Alright, our number 9 movie started off on the wrong foot and was really low. When the rankings first started coming in, it was in 11th place, and then just steadily started climbing. And landing with 418 points, we have our highest grossing film on this list with Wolf. This did get a healthy number of dead last spots with 8 in total, and the highest score that it got was 2nd place, which it got twice. So again, this is one where those that liked it ranked it high, and those that didn't ranked it low. No middle ground. And clearly I was in the former camp, because I ranked this one low, and I put it in 11th. Now, I had only seen this once before, and this was when it came out, and I distinctly remember not caring for it at all. So I wasn't really confident going in there. But honestly, it's not a terrible watch. It's actually a pretty decent flick. But in the end, there's just nothing that inspiring here. It's the same story that we've seen so many times before. Middle-aged dude feels old, and that the world is trying to replace him. Finds new energy, bangs a much younger woman. Yay! I almost wish that it was worse, because there's parts that border on camp. Like the line,
Well, are you an idiot? You nearly stampeded the horses last Monday. Can't you see that animals are disturbed by your presence?
is hilarious. And then you're just sitting there watching the movie, and then, bam, random Ross. And this was like pretty much right before Friends kicked off. So this is him just sort of doing whatever he could do before his big break. Just before he truly did break big. And, oh yeah, this part is filmed at the abandoned zoo in Los Angeles. And it's the same place where Police Academy 2 was filmed. and Arnold Schwarzenegger's Eraser, and even the zoo fight from Anchorman. It's all right here. And oh yeah, some film called The Last Amityville Movie was also partially shot here. But yeah, ultimately it's all very predictable, and it's easy to see every beat of this film before it happens. And then it just takes forever to happen. It's just an old guy adjusting to his life for over an hour and doesn't kick into the darker elements until far too late. And then, when the wolf stuff happens, it's like they were just like, oh, he doesn't become a werewolf, he just becomes Jack Nicholson in Easy Rider. And it's weird because Rick Baker did these effects. And it's like he said, well, everyone loves what I did for American Werewolf, and there's no topping that. So I'm not even going to try. So yeah, you're giving me a movie called Wolf, and then teasing that it's a take on the werewolf genre, and then you're not even going to give me an actual wolf, and instead, your fully transformed guy is less hairy than Jack Black. So I'm sorry, that's going to hold you back.
Suede shoes. Asparagus.
So it was a bit closer when it came to our number 8 movie, since only 9 points separated it from the number 9 entry. And there was a point where it looked like Wolf might catch up to this one, because with 409 points, we have our other more recent entry, Late Phases. This one was only ranked dead last twice, and spoiler alert, there's only 2 movies on this list with no dead last vote. But this was also put into first place once. And this is another one that I really enjoyed. I watched this one when it came out and went in totally blind and ended up having a blast with it. Like, in a way, it owes a lot to Bubba Hotep. Like just in terms of general setup. But really not much else. There's just not a ton of movies out there that revolve around an elderly retired person in an old age home facing off against a classic monster variation. But if someone wants to make any more, they seem to have a pretty solid rate of success. There's a nice curveball here in that the very instant that a particular actor shows up on screen, you basically just say, oh, okay, there's the werewolf. But then they throw that curve, and then they take things in a totally different direction. Granted, it's not exactly the most shocking of directions, but I'll admit that it wasn't exactly what I thought it was going to be. And here's the funniest bit. Lance Guest is in this. The Last Starfighter, Michael Brody, Jimmy from Halloween 2. And I watched this whole movie. And then the very next day, went to this Halloween convention with a ton of the stars of the various films. And Lance was there. And I was at his booth, and he had a bunch of photos out. And one of them was from Late Phases. And I'm looking at his pictures, and I'm thinking, oh, he was in Late Phases? Who was he in that? And I seriously couldn't remember him being in it at all. And it wasn't until I got home and put it back on and was like, oh my God, he's one of the freaking main characters. That's how unrecognizable that he is in this. But there's a lot of heart in this. And of course, it feels like a sort of a John Wick precursor in a way, what with killing off the dog. Like when that happens, you know that there's going to be some bloodshed coming. And of course, there is, and plenty of it. And come on, that transformation is pretty solid, but holy cow, that transition is smooth. Problem is, once they have the full werewolf in costume stuff, they don't really look that great. It has perhaps a too cartoonish kind of look, and doesn't totally fit with the grittier tone that the film has had up until this point. And then they just show it way too much, in too much light, and it sort of gives off like a Power Rangers vibe.
It's you ladies to the door, but I'm blind.
All right, the final film of the lower half of the list here was one that I was really curious to see how people felt about. And it was one that was all over the place with where it was placed. And it ended up with 387 points. And now let's check out Teen Wolf. This was put into dead last only one time, but it was put into first place twice and had a spot on pretty much every number here. And I've got this one a bit on the lower end since I had it in 9th place. But I guess that doesn't mean that I don't like it, because it's fine and all. But it's one that I thought I had nostalgia for, but I guess that I do not. I guess the biggest problem here is just how much of a formula that this one is. You pretty much know exactly where it's going at all times. Like, even for a silly 80s comedy, it's just a run-of-the-mill assortment of cliches. And I know that this was meant to be a comedy and not an FX extravaganza, but the transformation scene is pretty low-key. And keep in mind, this is in the era of the whole werewolf effects metamorphosis. Like, whole movies' reputations were made around them. And this comes in with this whole half-hearted stuff going on. But I'm going deeper here in that I'm not sure what this movie's message is. Like, he's born the wolf. He didn't choose it. But he did choose to be a dick when he got popular. But, like, the ending of the movie seems to be more about him not being the wolf and not him not being a dick. And it's weird that the message of the movie seems to kind of be that in order for him to be himself, he has to not be who he was born to be. Why can't he still be the wolf, but just not be a dick? Like, it turns out that there's a good deal of sources out there interpreting this as a metaphor for homosexuality, and a good portion of the film certainly seems that way, but if so, then the ending sure does seem to be a rejection of that. So you have this whole bit with the dad saying, hey, you're different, we're different, and we need to embrace it. And then the ending of the movie is like, hey, maybe don't really embrace that so hard? And I know that a bunch of you are out there saying, come on, man, it's just Teen Wolf. It's not that deep. And you may be right, but you're missing the point that I'm a writer, and writers like to analyze writing and consider intents and all of that. And even if you eliminate the metaphor aspect, it's still a questionable thing to have in there. Like, do you accept the part of you that's different, or don't you? But also, now's a good time to talk about the penis. For years, there was the talk that at the very end, a silly extra was in the back with his pants down and dong out. But that was in the pre-1080p days, because it's clearly just someone with their fly down. And according to an actress that was in the movie, it's not even a guy, it's a woman.
Give me a keg of beer.
Okay, moving up into the top half of the list now, and we're headed to our number 6. And it's not a big jump down in points from Teen Wolf, because we're still at 374 points. And this is one that's really, really split, because it's The Company of Wolves. And this is wild, because it was ranked in dead last 8 times, tied with Wolf in 9th place for how many it received. But it also got some really high rankings, including 3 first place spots. And oh man, what a strange trip that this one is. I popped it up in my 5th place spot, and I have a good amount of regard for this one. And it's weird, because I know that I saw this several times when I was younger, but I'm not sure that I can say that I had nostalgia for it, because I really had no clue what the hell was going on. It wasn't until I revisited it when I was older and really got into its crazy, dreamlike vibe. And I have to say, you can't get mad at the talent involved here. This cast list is insane. And when David Warner and Angela Lansbury walk in, you know you're dealing with some quality. But then Terrence Stamp rolls in for a minute and is all, okay, oh, hi, see you later. And keep in mind, this came out in 1984, and this was that era I mentioned where werewolf movies were still on a bit of a high. Not like 1981 high, but it was still a pretty marketable genre. But they go a totally different route than the other wolf movies at the time. And when I say totally different, I mean surreal and fractured narrative and somewhat of an anthology without actually being an anthology kinda different. And the effects are less successful, but still really fun. And you have to at least credit them with being unique. Some of the imagery that they throw at you for the transformations was pretty bold, and certain things have now become iconic. Like the whole snout out of the mouth thing that they liked enough to put on the damn poster. And then, as opposed to the Wolfman remake, This is how you make a throwback Gothic Victorian tale. Everything looks like an actual location. It's like they were actually there. Although I feel like this movie is blatantly eyebrowophobic. Like let the monobrows in peace, people. Everyone in this movie is like, don't trust people with one eyebrow. And I know, I saw Night of the Creeps too, and this does seem like good advice, but I don't know, someone's inability to pluck shouldn't just equal that person's straight up evil. And in the end, it's just such a weird way to make an adult version of Little Red Riding Hood, but also an intriguing way to do it. And it's one that I guess I fully understand not liking. It's obtuse at times, and not exactly the fastest moving of films, but I dig this whole hazy mood that it has going on. And maybe it's just that I like the whole concept of fractured fairy tales, but oh yeah, also with werewolves, but this one's a pretty big win for me.
The worst kind of wolves are hairy on the inside, and when they bite you, they drag you with them to hell.
Okay, now here's where we get really juicy, because the drop down here was massive. All of the previous films have been all over the place, with a lot of them being either love it or hate it. But when we get to number 5, we jump down almost a full 100 points, all the way down to 286, and it's the Stephen King classic, Silver Bullet. It was ranked in dead last one time, though, but was also given the first place spot twice. And look, this was a tough one for me because I gave this one 6th place, and holy cow do I enjoy a good chunk of this. But there's also parts of it that I'm not that crazy about, hence my drop down. For starters, it has one of my least favorite film devices, the voiceover narration. Now, I don't mind a narrator when they have a specific purpose, but what usually happens is that it ends up being a person simply describing to you what you're seeing on screen. And it's a film, not a book. You're supposed to show, not tell. But with a narrator, it's often doing both. Like I can see what you're doing. You don't need to also tell me at the same time. Like if you eliminated the voiceover from this film, it's hardly changed. Still, there's some all-time classic dialogue.
Sorry, babe.
I have to have some help.
It's your oven, but it ain't my bun. You got bacon in there, huh?
And I love that Marty is like, what if it's a werewolf after the first killing? And he's totally right. I mean, the odds that it was a werewolf were pretty broad. But I guess this kid should play the lotto or something with intuition like that. But Marty's also not that bright, nor is his uncle, since they both know that there's a killer on the loose that has already taken out several people in town. And yet he's still like, let's go out alone at night and make a bunch of noise and draw attention to myself. But the biggest issue with the story is the dream sequence. And I realize I'm going to have to do some spoilers here, but come on, this is like 40 years old by now. But the movie is sort of a whodunit. Like who's the werewolf? But then they do this whole dream sequence, and you're like, oh, that guy's the werewolf. But then they do this big reveal, and the movie treats it like, surprise! But you're not surprised, because they already tipped their hand. Like without that sequence, the reveal would have been a big shock and a great bit. That being said, it's a ton of fun, and Gary Busey is absolutely charming in it. Like, you see Gary Busey now, and you're saying, man, this guy's over the edge. And then you watch this, and it's even more of a shame, because he was pretty great, and he really steals this show. Oh, and let's discuss that werewolf, because it's pretty cool, but it's nothing special. I mean, compared to the other flicks coming out around this time, it's a nice effect, but doesn't really stand out. Although I do like it. It's cool.
I'm beginning to feel like a horse's ass. That's what.
Now, this was our closest race here, since there was only 1 point in between our number 5 and number 4 movies. 1 single point, and our number 4 movie snuck by the Silver Bullet, and it's Dog Soldiers. This did get 2 dead last votes, which is 1 more than Silver Bullet did, but it also got 3 first place nods, which is also 1 more than Silver Bullet did. And I think I helped boost this one a bit because I have it in 3rd. And holy crap, do I enjoy this one. Like, I certainly realize that is not for everyone, and I get why people can be turned off by it, but I think that this is just such a fun take on the tale. I mean, on one hand, it's sort of just Assault on Precinct 13 mixed with a touch of Night of the Living Dead, but it's also a lot more than that. But I love so many of the takes here, and I'm also a sucker for movies in which it's people in a house trying to fight something from getting in, as well as a fan of flicks in which the main characters are sufficiently armed and still face a challenge. Like, it's one thing to have to take on a villain or a creature or whatever while you're empty-handed, or just have like a kitchen knife or something. But here we have a group of guys with machine guns and adequate weaponry, plus survival skills, and they're still getting taken down. And that adds an element of fun and danger to the villain. Like, this isn't a killer versus a group of unskilled and unsuspecting teens. This is a trained group of military guys who can put up a fight. And man, do they do that. Also, I love the guy who is cowardly and yet faces the wolf head on. It's a cool bit of subversion and a great end to his character.
I'm gonna fucking have you!
And, you know, I'm not exactly what most people would call a manly man or macho or whatever. And I don't put a bunch of stock in, oh, this is what men do. Because honestly, I think the entire concept of that is, and insisting that something is manly, is probably the opposite of manly. But I think that there's a certain honor in these characters willing to fight to the very end and not just giving up. But the biggest problem with this one is you have an entire cast of guys, and they're all sort of basic white guys with the same haircut and wearing the same outfit, and they all just blend together, which makes it a bit tough to really connect with their individual characters. Like, even their personalities kind of blend a bit, with minor, like, quirks that do distinguish them. But honestly, it's not really enough. Like, there's a moment where one is taken out the window, and I actually paused and said, who was that? But one major plus here is the werewolf design. Oh crap, do these things look imposing and cool. Like, I know I've said that I like a bipedal look for them, and this is a great example of how I think they ought to look. Like, they're reminiscent of the ones from the Howling. Seem to draw some inspiration for their look from that. And it works. Like, they look great. And I just really like this one.
I hope I give you the shits, you fucking wimp.
Time for the top three, and looking at what's left, I think what's number 3 is pretty expected, because I think it was always a question of the top 2. So our bronze medal here is another heavy hitter, but I think more of a cult one. And with 258 points, we're looking at Ginger Snaps. People were split on this one again, since it was put in dead last 3 times, but it was put in first place 5 times, our highest number of number 1s so far. And I had this one pretty high myself, in 4th place. So I just had this one and Dog Soldiers in the opposite order. But this is a really great film. And there's so much going on here, and a lot to sink your teeth into. And this easily falls into that whole notion that they tack onto elevated horror, where your movie says that it's about something, but it's clearly about something else. And this movie is very obviously paralleling a young woman changing into something else as she gets older. And the coming of age aspects here are well integrated into the story, and the parallels between dealing with the changes of being a werewolf and a girl getting her period for the first time are interesting and feel fresh. And I realize that it's not exactly something that I personally relate to, as it's not something I've actually gone through, but they do a good job of conveying what those changes do to a person and how they perceive themselves. Although I do think that the addition of the tail is a bit silly. But the breakout here, for me, is Mimi Rogers, and the aspect of the clueless mother who really wants to help, but in all the wrong ways, is sadly the part that I relate to now. Like, I remember seeing this film when I was younger. Obviously, I related more to the younger set, and her character seemed so out of touch and goofy. But now, I'm in that same position. I mean, not the mother part, but you know. And holy crap, does that seem like a realistic portrayal? And I like the little touches, like the fact that they trick Sam into thinking it's Bridget changing and assume that he won't realize, since most guys don't really recognize changes in young women. But it's nice that they subvert that a bit and have him realize pretty early on. And since we're discussing the suit design aspect of all of these, sure, this is a really cool final wolf. Like, I mean, it's a quadruped, and those types generally aren't where my mind tends to go with them. But it's not like that'll make it or break it, because this wolf is badass. And this might be weird to say, but I like that they still had it look vaguely feminine, and I don't know, maybe kind of cat-like. And I don't think that anyone really expects happy endings from werewolf flicks overall, but this one is particularly devastating. It's hard.
I said I would die for you.
No, you said you'd die with me, because you had nothing better to do.
Okay, the big battle. When it comes to werewolf movies, there's a particularly deep rivalry that has been going on all the way since 1981, where they first faced off at the box office, and once again, they're staring each other down. But there can be only one winner, or runner-up, with a pretty light 208 points. We have The Howling. It's the first movie on the roster to not get a single dead last vote, but it did get one 9th place ranking, and it was put in the number 1 spot 7 times. And holy crap, was this a tough call for me, because I love both of these movies. But when it comes down to it, I really had to compare and contrast the two. I put The Howling as my number 1. Like, when I really considered it, I realized that The Howling just sort of feels more like the perfect mixture of what I want from a werewolf movie. Like, the setting is right, since you're giving me this sort of remote village out by the woods, and the perfect werewolf environment. The mood is right, and it just has this gothic feel and mystery, and there's just something about it that manages to capture the vibe of the classic films while also updating things for a new breed. There's also that whole inside baseball aspect of it that's distinctly fun for horror fans. Since you're getting Dee Wallace, Patrick McNee, Kevin McCarthy, and John Carradine, but then you're also getting fun cameos from Forey Ackerman, Roger Corman, Mick Garris, Dick Miller, plus the quick bonus of an early role from Hollywood Melrose himself. And let's talk about that transformation and that wolf design, because they're both absolute wins. Like, granted, the changing scene isn't as impressive as the one in American Werewolf, but keep in mind, that one had Rick Baker using things that he'd been thinking about and developing for years, and he was supposed to do those things on this movie, but he was pulled off of it at the last minute, and Rob Bottin just kind of stepped in and had to develop stuff without all of that preparation. And guess what? He killed it. Like, granted, the air bladder stuff looks dated. It was something that was imitated over and over and over again. And now you look at it and it's not that impressive. But you have to understand that it truly, truly was back then. And look at this wolf. This thing is exactly what I want from a werewolf. It's the first movie that I can think of that didn't just treat a werewolf as a basically hairier human being. Like, this thing looks like the perfect combination of the two things. And two other things. First up, this movie is technically in the same universe as Gremlins. They coexist. And that's not just because they share the same director. No, it actually features a newsman character named Lou Landers. And that same guy appears in Gremlins, reporting on the events there. So this is a world in which there could ultimately be a lycanthrope versus mogwai battle and feud, like a distorted version of Underworld or something. And also, second thing, just imagine how much more beloved that this movie would be if instead of having Christopher Stone in the male lead, that they had Tom Atkins in there. Not that he was ever considered for the cast or anything, but the dude just looks so much like him. It doesn't have that Atkins swagger.
Tonight I'm gonna show you something.
make you believe.
And that leaves us with only one film left. Only one remains as the victor, and honestly, as much as I wanted it to be a real close face-off between these two behemoths, it wasn't even close, since with a mere 110 points, almost a full 100 points less than the Howling, we have American Werewolf in London. And this is the other film on the list to not get any dead last votes, and the lowest it got was a single 8th place. But it was put in the first place position 28 times, more than half of the lists. And yeah, obviously, since The Howling was my number one, I wasn't one of them, but this was still my second place. And it was very, very close. And I'll say this, between the two, I think that this is the better film. But when I'm thinking of what I personally want from a werewolf movie, I just dig that other one like a smidge more. But, I mean, what else can you say about American Werewolf? It's just a great film. It's not a perfect film in that there's some plot issues that I just can't get past. So I'll get the negative out of the way. Like, I just never really think that the whole love story clicks. Like, they hook up for a few days, but then the movie just sort of expects us to be like, their love is strong and great. But we don't really get that from the film itself, and I wish that it had established that a bit more. Secondly, I think that the ending is a touch too easy and anticlimactic. I mean, I love the bit in the alleyway, but then he's just taken out by a bunch of regular bullets? Like, with how steep in the more traditional werewolf lore that the rest of this film is, I was a bit bummed that it ended up being that easy to kill it off. And okay, with the only negatives that I have out of the way, let's lavish this thing with the praise that it deserves, because there's so much to love here. The characters are great, and they're all so well established and feel unique, even down to the minor side characters like Doc Hirsch. But there's also a lot of discussion about how this redefined werewolf movies. And that's valid and all, but can we talk about how it also redefines horror comedies? It's a pitch-perfect blend of the two, with equal amounts of both. It's funny at the right times and scary at others, and that's likely due to our favorite helicopter dropper, John Landis. Like, he both wrote and directed this one. And he didn't write all of his films, and it's interesting because a lot of directors make that easy to tell. Like you can see the differences between the scripts that they wrote versus the ones that they didn't. And some have a tendency to handle films that they didn't, like work for hire. But Landis actually handled this nicely. I don't think that he invested any less in films that he didn't write himself. But with this one, he did. And even though he had help from noted comics on his more comedy-oriented scripts, like having Dan Aykroyd write Blues Brothers, or Steve Martin and Lorne Michaels on Three Amigos, or even Eddie Murphy on Coming to America. But no, on this, he handled it solo. And the comedy really pops. Like, the interplay between Jack and David, like, those are some highlights. Even considering the grim setup for their scenes together and the reality of their situation. But you know that I can't really not talk about that transformation scene, because it won an Oscar. It won the first special effects Oscar. That's how cool it is. And one thing I'll say is that the scene still holds up today. It's just as effective now as it was then. And even though I tend to prefer my werewolves standing up and not, as Landis described it, a devil dog from hell, I have to say that this creature is damn cool looking. Like, you don't get to see it a whole lot, and the film probably benefits from keeping it under wraps most of the time. But when you do see it, it's great. So, yeah, I mean, it may not be my number one, but it's super damn close. And for a very large majority of you out there, there's no competition.
What are you doing here? You promised never to do this kind of thing again.
I never promised you any such thing.
Not you Twitter.
I've never seen you before in my life.
Oh, sorry.
So there you have it. 12 movies, 12 great werewolf movies, all ranked up in a particular order. Let's take a look at this list and see how we feel about it. I feel pretty good about most of this. There's a couple of things I probably would switch around. Obviously, it doesn't match my particular list, but I'm not mad about any of these. I'm certainly not mad about American Werewolf getting the #1 spot. I think that the top 4 is absolutely the correct movies to have in that top 4. I like all these movies. Actually, I enjoyed most of these movies. I think that really there's only 1 or 2 that I probably wouldn't watch again on a regular basis here and there. They're mostly pretty fine. And yeah, some of them are actually straight up art and fantastic films and should be seen. But yeah, let me know what other werewolf movies you'd like us to rank. I mean, obviously, there was a lot. My initial list of werewolf movies to consider having in this episode, there was about 30 different movies. But honestly, there's not a lot of them that are really noteworthy or great. A lot of them are more hidden, kind of like undergroundy kind of things, less popular, less accessible. And one of the things I consider when I'm making these lists are what movies are accessible for my patrons to be able to find and watch easily. And also, I try to find ones that are more commonly seen, so I don't want to have to ask people to watch a whole bunch of movies every single month. Sometimes people are only able to watch a couple, so I try to include things that are fairly commonly seen. But let me know some other werewolf movies that you think are pretty awesome and belong on this list as well, too. Just keep in mind, they were considered. I didn't forget them. I know you're going to say, you forgot this one. I didn't forget them. I just didn't include them. But yeah, let me know how your list would have looked. Let me know how you would have ranked these movies. What would your #1 have been? Tell me in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button. If you enjoy the channel, hit the subscribe button. Go to my Patreon page at patreon.com/movietimelines and become a patron where you can actually participate in these rankings every single month. And yeah, keep on coming back and watching these videos. And I'll see you very shortly for another great one. Thanks a lot, guys, and bye-bye.